welcome back to Bonn. I'm here with Alden Meyer from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Alden, you're going to give us a bit of an update on what's going on here today. So we'll start with that.
Okay. Well, we're near the end. Tomorrow's the last day here. Everyone's waiting to see what the chair of the negotiations puts out this afternoon in the form of a new so-called non-paper from her. Non-paper is a strange UN term which means it's a substantive paper. It has a lot of substance in it, but it doesn't have official status under the UN rules. It's not a legal document. It'll basically be her views on changes she makes in her negotiating text coming into this meeting based on the discussions they've had here over the last 2 weeks. So we'll see where she thinks the convergences happened, where some of the disagreements may have been reduced, and where the stumbling block still remains. So that's supposed to come out at 6 o'clock, about 3 hours from now. People will be swarming the document room, running off to read that, comparing notes and comparing it to the old text and seeing where we stand. I talked to her yesterday. Her hope is that by releasing it tonight, it gives the country delegates here all day tomorrow to consult informally within their regional groups. That's most important for the G77 and China bloc of developing countries because they have a very difficult time coordinating in between formal negotiating sessions. So she wants to give them time here tomorrow to have an initial exchange of views, see what they think, because her hope is you can come into the next meeting here in Bonn in August 2nd, hitting the ground running and starting to actually negotiate on the basis of this new paper, not debating whether or not this paper is the correct forum to go forward in. So we'll see what the reaction is tomorrow. And of course, we're still reeling a little bit from the very bloody fight last night over the proposal by the Alliance of Small Island States that the Secretariat produce a technical paper summarizing the state of the science since the IPCC report 3 years ago now, and what that means for the desirability and the feasibility of limiting temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Of course, that's the more stringent goal that AOSIS fought for in Copenhagen. Didn't succeed in getting into the Copenhagen Accord. The Copenhagen Accord sets 2 degrees as the political goal, but it does call for a review of the 1.5 degree target in the time frame of 2015. So AOSIS was trying to jumpstart that by getting a little technical paper into the process between now and the meeting in Cancun in December, and they were blocked by 4 of the oil-producing countries, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Venezuela. And that was a very bloody, very personal fight late last night. They tried to patch it up this morning. They couldn't reach agreement, and so there's no agreement to go forward with that paper. But the interesting thing is it shook up the politics a little bit. You had all the industrial countries, the U.S., Japan, Europe, and others, as well as all the developing countries, with the exception of those 4 OPEC countries, siding with AOSIS, saying this is a reasonable thing to ask. They have a right, as the most vulnerable countries in the world, to have this discussion, to have this kind of technical paper. So even though they lost procedurally, I think in a political sense, they won by exposing the isolation of the handful of blocking countries like Saudi Arabia.
And I guess the response amongst kind of campaigners and activists here has been one of disbelief and anger. This was a technical paper, and it wasn't a proposal. I get what the question that I have is, what were they scared of? Why block this paper?
Well, I mean, the concern of those that are linked to fossil fuel production, like Saudi Arabia, is twofold. One, it's that by putting out this kind of analysis, you get on the table the more recent science that shows that the impacts of climate change are higher at lower temperature increases than was previously thought, and therefore that the damage to vulnerable countries, not only the small island states, but Africa, coastal nations like Bangladesh and others, is going to be more extensive than we thought. The costs and feasibility of adaptation are going to be higher and more difficult than we thought. These are inconvenient facts that the Saudis would like to keep out of the formal discussion here. The other issue, of course, is this shows the need for a much higher level of ambition than we've experienced to date in this process, and for both the industrialized and the major developing countries to try to up their game and do more between now and 2020 to give us a better shot at averting the kind of impacts that the latest science talks about. So it's not that the technical paper has any formal status as negotiating text, but it injects some issues and some political dynamics into this process that those that want to go slow and do very little or nothing would rather avoid.
And we've just been speaking to representatives from WWF about the road to Cancun and what might be achieved there. These are the first kind of substantive talks since Copenhagen. How do you think they kind of bode for Cancun? What are we looking at achieving there?
Well, I mean, I think everyone wants to try to achieve a package of decisions that can move us forward on some of the easier issues, like a framework for moving money into reducing deforestation, or setting up a technology cooperation mechanism, or advancing the Nairobi Plan of Action on adaptation for the most vulnerable countries. There's some things that there's very broad consensus on. We really had pretty much consensus in Copenhagen on a number of these issues, but they got caught in the backwash of those last few days in the Bella Center and the controversy over both the substance and the process of the Copenhagen Accord. So I think the hope is that you can grease the skids for those kind of decisions being made. I think the missing ingredient there is finance. I think they've got to get agreement on a new financial mechanism and institution to be created, and they've got to have some hope of a substantial ramping up of financial resources going into these issues, into adaptation for the most vulnerable countries, into moving clean energy technology in a more broadband way, into helping reducing the rate and eventually eliminating deforestation in the tropical rainforests. If you can get that kind of framework set up and you can get the prospect of substantial money, I think that will improve the tone and the spirit of the talk, even if you don't get the final deal. Obviously, we would still like to get the final full-blown legal deal in Cancun that we weren't able to achieve in Copenhagen, but the divisions on that in terms of splits between countries like the U.S. and China on the form of that deal, disagreements about how aggressive efforts ought to be by both developed and developing countries and in what time frame, issues like historical responsibility for past emissions and the so-called climate debt that many of the developing countries believe they are owed by the northern industrialized countries. These are all very difficult, very political issues that could prevent a full-blown deal in 6 months. But that being said, if you can get a package of decisions on the issues I talked about, that would change the spirit and prove that the UN negotiation process itself can deliver the goods. I mean, I think coming out of Copenhagen, there was a sense that it fell well short. It was a disappointment, a failure. And some have questioned the viability of this process to make much happen. So I think there's a lot riding on Cancun in the sense of restoring the credibility of the United Nations negotiating process itself beyond the actual decisions that are achieved there. That being said, we don't have a lot of time. We're behind the curve. Emissions have been increasing. Concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have been increasing nonstop. And of course, we're on track. Even if we were able to halt emissions on the dime tomorrow, we're on track for more devastating impacts in the next couple of decades, no matter what we do. So now it's a choice between dangerous impacts and truly catastrophic impacts that might be irretrievable, irreversible on a scale of decades or centuries. And that's the stakes that we're talking about here. It's really, are we leaving our children and grandchildren any kind of viable planet to try to live on for the next decades and centuries?